Kia ora Aotearoa, good evening and welcome to the Union Report, where we review the news week through the lens of industrial disputes with union leaders, commentators and politicians. Joining me tonight to discuss events is political commentator Mike Williams and the Industrial Services Manager for the New Zealand Nurses Organisation, C. Payne. Welcome to you both. Coming up tonight, Issue 1. It's International Nurses Day on the 12th. What are the challenges facing nursing, and why is the NZNO concerned with social justice? Issue 2. Does the U-turn at MFAT show other public servants how to resist cutbacks? Is 150 job losses a victory? Issue 3. The hikoi against asset sales arrives in Wellington. How does privatisation impact workers? And we'll wrap the show with a final thought and preview upcoming events. But let's start tonight with Issue 1. This Saturday is International Nurses Day. Are we meeting the challenges of nursing in the 21st century? And how can an issue as open and shut as their dispute with Oceania still be dragging? See, we have this ridiculous situation where Oceania had been given extra funding to pay your members more for aged care, yet the company hadn't passed the taxpayer funding on to your members. What on earth is going on?
Well, it's been a bit of a struggle over the years to get governments to really tag some funding in the provider contract for aged care workers. But many of them have sort of made a sort of a pseudo kind of commitment to that. It's never as straightforward as saying to the company, you need to pass it on. But we definitely think it's only fair that workers get a cut of the money that government is sending across to these private providers. And many of them are multinational companies with great big funds. So the good news is that actually Oceania have passed on the same level of funding now.
That's great news.
Yeah,
congratulations.
It's fantastic, and only achieved through the hard work of all of those workers in Oceania being prepared to take industrial action.
So you had to really push them for them to send that money that they had been given through to you.
Yep, they wouldn't be the only company we have to push, but many of them are reluctant to pass on any funding to wages. And in fact, Oceania were asking for cuts to the workers' conditions, and still weren't being prepared to make some sort of pay offer. So yeah, we're really delighted that they've finally come up to what is the required amount in the sector that we'd see, but it's still far.
See, is there any back pay involved in this?
They've taken back some back pay back, a short distance. I don't know that we've been able to cover the whole gap, but the funding that was passed on is minuscule compared to what's really needed in the sector.
Mike, why is it the professions dominated by women seem to get less? The NZNO are making a submission to the Human Rights Commission Equal Employment Opportunity investigation. Is sexism entrenched when it comes to what women can expect as take-home wage?
Oh yeah, it's still alive and well. I was looking at the numbers before I came on this program. It is, you expect to get less as a woman for doing the same work. It's outrageous. Although, that's happened in the public service, is equal work for equal pay, but it just does not appear to be catching on in the private sector. And my view is there'll have to be legislation on this. I can't see any alternatives.
So you don't think that the private sector are prepared to actually front with the public sector and give women the same
There's
rights?
a whole complex of arguments around this. It's not as easy as it seems. Women very often have disturbed work history. They take time off, so they go back down the ladder. But I think that's got to be addressed. Certainly, I think the public sector has done a wonderful job, really since Helen Clark agitated about this in the 80s. But the private sector has got a long way to go.
Are we getting enough women on the boards of directors as
Certainly not. Again, the public sector boards, you'll see, Genesis Energy, I can remember half the board was were women when I was there. But again, your basic corporations, the big private sector companies, you can count them on the fingers of one hand.
Even the SOEs though, Mike, I think there's only 4 women out of about 36.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah, board chairs, and I mean, women are really, really underrepresented even in that level of government.
What are we saying to our sisters, our daughters, our mothers then as fellow citizens in our own country, that you don't actually get as much as us?
Well, I think we definitely are not saying that women are capable enough of holding these positions if we're not actually being prepared to appoint them. And there are many, many women with the calibre and skills to take on these jobs, and they just don't get there with the cut. I've seen a beautiful lineup of all those heads of SOEs, and nearly every one of them's a male. I think there were 4, and we're now down to about 3 because one was resigning. So it's quite astounding.
How does that culture change, Mike? How do you get that culture to really change?
I don't know. I think you saw it reflected in that bizarre statement by Alistair, head of the Employers Federation. What's his name?
Oh,
Thompson.
yeah.
Alistair Thompson. And I think those attitudes are out there that, women take 3 days off a month, which is scientifically incorrect.
Right.
But I think that what Alistair Thompson said, has echoes for a lot of employers, and that's just a generational thing. I think it'll change over time.
All right.
Well, you've got to hope it'll change over
fingers
time.
crossed. This year's theme for International Nurses Day is Closing the Gaps, Evidence to Action. Why are nurses focused on social inequality as a health issue?
Well, we do know that, if people are in poverty or they don't have access to, good sanitation, if they don't have an adequate level of income to be able to provide good, healthy food for their families, a whole lot of reasons, and we call them the social determinants of health. But if those things don't happen, then people are compromised in terms of the kind of health issues that they'll have. And in New Zealand, I mean, it's a tragedy to be able to have to actually say that there are, the incidence of third world disease, things like rheumatic fever are on the rise in New Zealand, and, it shouldn't be happening.
Shouldn't we be ashamed of poverty-related diseases coming back to a first world country?
We should be ashamed of poverty-related diseases. We have an A1 health system, there's no doubt about that, but it's... and so that's about getting the treatment when you need it, but people shouldn't be getting unwell in the first place. And there's so much more that you can do if you could intervene in some of those issues and actually prevent illness happening in our community. The whole thing about closing the gap from evidence to action, I mean, nurses work in terms of delivering their clinical care with a philosophy that if we can demonstrate some evidence about an intervention that would be better, let's do that. And by, so that's about the action part, and how do we do that? And there's a whole lot of strategies that nurses have around how you can do that. We've looked at that from a union perspective in terms of nurses' employment and said, well, we've got evidence about nurses' employment and caregivers and other health workers that we represent, and what's the action they need to take to shift those problems. So using a similar model, but one that nursing adopts, and is the theme for this year's International Nurses Day around closing the gap.
Some would argue unions should only focus on direct outcomes for their members, but seeing as the union movement has inspired the weekend, child labour laws, overtime, minimum wage, injury and redundancy protections, does a working life demand a wider political engagement and representation than just what you get paid hourly?
I think it does. I think the argument that workers should only focus on wages and conditions is well out of date. I was talking to a friend of mine who is a nurse in Northland, and what she said to me is she's sick and tired of being the ambulance at the bottom of the cliff, particularly as far as respiratory ailments in children are concerned. And she said to me, why don't they put a fence at the top of the cliff? And I said, well, what would that be? And she said, well, warm homes that aren't damp.
Absolutely.
And we're paying the price at one end of the scale when we really should be avoiding it by having a good solid program of warm, comfortable houses. I went door knocking in Manurewa electorate 4 years ago now, and I was staggered at how many of the sheds out the back are actually sleep outs with no sanitary stuff at all. People go and sleep there. Now, they're not appropriate to bring up children in, and that's what's happening in our backyard.
Do you think part of the problem is a 3-year electoral cycle? Let's be honest, you're only focused on the next 6 months, maybe at tops. You just don't have the time or the forethought for these much wider capital investments into the poverty issue. Is it because we're only very focused on the short term?
I don't know that it's about being focused on the short term that's the problem. I think the problem is that as a community we have to all take a collective responsibility that our kids aren't living in poverty, that our kids aren't struggling to, have the normal things that you'd need to be able to have a purposeful life in this country. And I just think that at the moment in this country we've got a set of policies that are driving the wedge and increasing inequity between the rich and the poor in this country.
There is
and it's time we
something-
changed it.
Right.
There is something a little weird, isn't it, about the egalitarian state of New Zealand, where 150 families made $7 billion more in a year, and 250,000 children live beneath poverty. That's something. There's something wrong with
Look,
it.
I think there's two aspects to that. Unfortunately, the kind of people who live in abject poverty and the people in the sleep houses are the people least likely to vote.
Right.
And even more of them stayed away from voting last time. We've really got to get some sort of movement going amongst these people. And many of them are simply, they've had it. You know, they think I can't alter my circumstances at all. But I do think there is a movement around the world about this gap between rich and poor. And you saw Hollande elected this morning on a policy of putting taxes up for the rich.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I am always disgusted when I hear that the government's cutting this. We've got the latest one, faster paybacks for student loans. Well, that's a $30 a week wage cut for a lot of families.
Yeah.
And yet we've got $2.5 billion for tax cuts for the rich.
There was actually a really a wonderful story, I call it, in the Auckland Herald recently, and it was called Tale of Two Cities, Mind the Widening Gap. And it very clearly demonstrated the shift in income that's happened. And the biggest shifts happen in terms of equity between the top 1% and the rest of the people in our community when we reduce the top tax rate.
Right. It's as simple as that, isn't it?
And at the moment, I mean, we've been in a situation where there's only been a 5% gap in New Zealand. It's double that now. It's closer to 10%. And it's simply, it requires governments to actually take more tax from the rich. I'm sick of hearing ministers say that because of Christchurch earthquake, $12 billion, we can't afford to do this, and this.
Yeah.
And, you know, we know in the health sector that DHB's having an increase in funding, but the increase doesn't even match inflation.
Sure.
So in real terms, they haven't got one. And if you wanted to generate more revenue in this country, you don't do it by cutting the top tax rate. You do it by actually increasing taxes on those that can afford to pay. And I'm one of those that can afford to pay.
Thank you, panel. Moving on with issue 2. Does the U-turn at MFAT show other public servants how to resist cutbacks? Mike, are 150 job losses a victory?
No, it's not a victory. The problem with this is people don't have a lot of sympathy for the MFAT workers who have some pretty good salaries and conditions. However, you know, all this talk about we've got to increase exports, we've got to engage in these free trade agreements, this is exactly the wrong place to cut back. Having said that, I think the MFAT workers have handled it brilliantly, particularly a great flood of leaks. It seems to me that Phil Goff actually receives cabinet papers before Murray McCully these
that's
days.
right,
So,
yeah. See, does the U-turn at MFAT provide hope that well-organised protest can force the government away from policy deemed self-defeating?
I absolutely believe that one of the legitimate roles for unions in this country, and I think many New Zealanders know this even if they don't choose to join a union, is that, you know, the action that you can take collectively together and stand up or make submissions, propose legislation, take industrial action, all of the range of tactics that you can use collectively do make a difference. And so it's really, really important that we actually do stick together in those times. It doesn't matter whether that worker's earning more than you. That's not the point. Every single additional person on the who's unemployed in this country is not contributing to our success. And I mean, unemployment's sitting at what? It's gone up again. And I know that's low if you look across to Greece and people say it's low, so it's relatively low. But it's rising, and we've got you know, an unemployment rate, the highest ever for Pacific Island people at this point in time, 16%. I think young people, young people, absolutely horrific rates of unemployment, and we've got to turn it around. So every worker at MFAT deserves a job.
Yeah. Mike, if one were to be cynical, and allow me to be cynical, one could suggest that the government followed a well-walked tactic with MFAT by suggesting something outrageous so that their watered-down counter looks like the government has listened and moderated the position. Was that the case here?
Well, your question supposes that this was an intelligent strategy. I don't think it was. I think it was just a shambles. I think McCully told the head of Foreign Affairs and Trade, his name's Alan, I think, what to do. He went out to do it, and then McCulley then thought, oh my God, the shit's at the fan. You know, let's pull back. But what I would say is that there are actually three major disputes, if you include this MFAT thing. One is the Ports of Auckland, one is AFCO, and there's this. And there is a great lesson for all unionists. They've got to stick together. Now, the Ports of Auckland clearly thought, the directors and management thought that the union members would abandon union membership and drift back to work. Well, I'm told that hardly happened at all. And the same thing is happening with AFCO. They're holding firm. And that's the strength of a union, is in solidarity, and that's what we're seeing in three instances at the moment.
Yeah,
And we had, last year we had the CMP Rangitikei dispute, similar. You know, those workers stood really strong. I mean, it was amazing, and the union movement pulled together. We were adopting families to support, to keep those families fed. And, you know, communities got to get up and behind their own citizens. These people have a right to have work and decent work and not be treated badly by their employer.
Yeah. With all government expenditure facing austerity cuts, should the movement expect less?
Well, good question. I don't see, I guess my argument, and I put it earlier in the program, but, you know, the austerity is a government-created austerity. I mean, there is plenty of wealth in this country, and there are plenty of people with plenty of money, even ordinary workers, and I think I get paid more than an ordinary worker, but I got a huge dish in tax cut. I didn't need that money, and so I think it's fabricated. I think our community can afford to have everybody in a decent job, pay them a decent living wage, and support them to have decent way of life in this country. It's about sharing that money around and sharing it more fairly. I don't buy with it at all. Many of us earn more than we need to have a decent lifestyle, and there's no reason why we can't pay more tax.
Question to both of you then on the final one on this one. Is a zero budget the right response to a recession?
The zero budget is an admission of failure. They've failed to grow the economy in any proper way. And, you know, to say this is a wonderful thing, it's a terrible thing. We have natural growth in our population, certainly in the areas of education and older people. You've got to spend more. This can't go forever, and it is an admission of failure. But again, I take C's point here. This is all manufactured. We would be in surplus or close to it if we hadn't given away $2.5 billion in tax cuts to the rich. And I was in the same position, see. I didn't need that money.
No.
You know, manna from heaven, but for God's sake, I'd much rather it was spent insulating houses in South Auckland.
Yep.
Is a zero budget the right response?
Never, in my view. Never, in my view. I don't think a zero budget is helping anybody in this country, and governments need to, find the resources that are there, and there are resources there to be had that can be spent on the important issues to make sure that we've got a decent society.
Thank you, panel. Moving on with issue 3, the hikoi against asset sales arrived in Wellington. How does privatisation impact workers? Mike, in their submission on the privatisation of assets, the Council of Trade Unions warned partial privatisation would see less democratic oversight and control. Why should that concern workers?
Well, because workers benefit from democratic oversight and control. I know that I was a director, in fact I was deputy chairman of Genesis Energy, and as an SOE we had to be a paradigm of being a good employer, and we bent over backwards to be a good employer, and that was in our charter laid down by the government. Now, you know, you've got some fairly cowboy employers out there, and to have that kind of attitude creep into these very large companies. I mean, Genesis, when I was there, employed I think nearly 1,000 people. Some of the other ones are even bigger. It will be a setback for the workers, no doubt about it.
See, if the focus is on profits, how do the non-financial social obligations of these state-owned assets get measured?
Say it another way.
Well, how would the social obligations that they've currently got entrenched, how would they get measured if it's just a profit overall?
Well, I mean, we don't support companies, you know, using profit as their baseline and deciding how they operate, and certainly when you look at health as an issue in itself, and we've seen the whole of the aged care or care for elderly privatised in New Zealand. There hasn't been a positive outcome for workers in this country. What it's meant is that many workers are on the minimum rates of pay, and absolutely for the elderly themselves, the standard of care, because we can't staff those hospitals to the standard that we would want, and there's no requirement to staff them to certain levels by government, then you know, the outcome is that, you know, everyone is the worse off, both the patients and the workers. So a lot of people say, why would a health union be concerned about privatisation, particularly state asset sales? And that's quite a hard one to answer for our members, because a lot of our members will say, you know, well, shouldn't you just be concerned about health? But in fact, you know, the privatisation of power companies, which is being proposed in this latest privatisation or partial privatisation or sell-off of state assets, actually has a huge ramification for people in terms of having healthy homes. Because if the cost of power goes up and it is untrammeled, and our evidence has shown us that if you privatise health, the costs go up. We can look across to America. We all know the quadrants. America sits in the high cost, low productivity quarter. New Zealand sits in the low cost, high productivity quarter. So privatisation doesn't necessarily mean good things for people. And my concern and our concern for people in terms of power privatisation is that people will face higher power prices, and our homes will be more difficult to heat, and there will be greater social impact on our community.
Question to both of you. The CTU submission also warned that the latest round of free trade deals in the United States negotiating team today warned New Zealand not to get stuck in 19th century negotiating concerns like tariffs to protect domestic jobs. Should workers embrace free trade, or are they always the casualty of liberalisation?
They're very often the casualty of liberalisation, but I think that the government has got to take a broader approach in things like procurement. Now, for example, the government chose to buy railway wagons overseas and not having built at the Hillside Railway Workshops in Dunedin. Now, they did that simply on the price quoted in a total of about $40 million was about $4 or $5 million more from Hillside. Now, if you looked at that from an NZ Inc. point of view, and you actually included retaining the skills of those workers in New Zealand, keeping those workers as taxpayers, keeping them off the dole, then I think probably the Hillside proposal for New Zealand Inc. as a whole was a hell of a lot better than having them built in China. And that's the sort of analysis I'd like to see happen.
Would you be happy for the NZNO, would they be happy to see Pharmac chopped up and sold off effectively for American corporates?
Certainly not, and we've been quite vocal in our opposition to any change to Pharmac. Pharmac has, while it had some initial teething problems, I think that it has made huge savings for NZ, you know, in terms of purchasing power around medicines. And you know, while some medicines, of course, you know, Pharmac doesn't subsidise, and that can cause alarm in the community, and as we've seen with the Herceptin debate, and it's important that we do respond to those community initiatives, and I think Pharmac needed to hear that. But, you know, for New Zealand, I think it has been a huge bonus. I mean, it drives an efficiency into our health system, and it makes sure people get medicines at an affordable price. What can be bad about that?
Apparently, it doesn't make enough money for American corporates. Final question here. How do unions negotiate with overseas corporations when the rules are being written for them by a government that seems to be happy to sell our labour law on?
Well, it's with difficulty, obviously. Look what happened with the Lord of the Rings, no, The Hobbit. Unions have got to be a lot faster on their feet. I was pleased to hear there was a CTU spokesman on, I think, the earthquake this morning, and I think under Helen Kelly, you are seeing the CTU get a hell of a lot more clout and, you know, make intelligent comments in a whole range of areas, not just wages and conditions. So I think that's a good move.
How do you find having to deal with overseas corporations? Is it more difficult if the rules are being written for them?
I definitely think it's more difficult for us when we're negotiating with some of those multinationals in aged care, because they actually don't really care what happens in this country. Their interest is about making profit, taking that money out of the country, and we're left to pick up the mess, actually. So they're often very, very difficult to negotiate with, particularly things like industrial action. They turn a bit of a blind eye to. It doesn't matter how much we do it. And so we really need, when we're taking that kind of action, we need the rest of the New Zealand community to stand behind our workers, because after all, at the end of the day, it's about care for their family members and about a decent health system in this country. So no, we'd say no to more multinationals any day.
Thank you, panel. Let's wrap the show with a final word. Mike, your final word this week is?
Well, I think the most interesting development on the industrial front in many years occurred last week, and that was Sonny Tao, on behalf of a large number of iwi, threatening to withhold cattle from AFCO. And he claimed to be able to control 48,000 sheep and cows. And what I noticed is that the very aggressive spokesman for AFCO, a gentleman called Rowan Ogg, suddenly became very conciliatory. And what you're seeing is Maori who over many years have been slowly accumulating economic clout, actually using it for the benefit of their own people. And what Sonny Tao said, there's a lot of Maori families suffering because of the intransigence of AFCO, and he got a pretty immediate response. And I think you may see real good come of this, and I'd like to see more of that.
Absolutely. C, final word from you?
Well, and speaking on, good things from Māori ministers, I'd have to say Minister Turia's statement about wanting to see the end of smoking in this country has got to be a positive for the health of this country. But I do have to do a plug for International Nurses Day.
Yes.
And in Aotea Square in Auckland in the morning, there is going to be a whole range of health professionals who are down there willing to talk to you about any health issues and giving good advice. So if you can support this event, it'd be fantastic, people of Auckland.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you, C. Coming up events-wise, International Nurses Day is this Saturday. The New Zealand Nurses Organisation and Service Food Workers Union are running a postcard campaign aimed at Oceania CEO Guy Eadie to gain the money the government have earmarked for aged care. I'm sure you'll still want to send those postcards. And starting May 21st, the PPTA, in coordination with Massey University, are running a series of public meetings on charter schools. Check out our Facebook site for full event details and follow me on my Citizen Bomber Twitter account for all the latest show updates. Thank you for watching Aotearoa. Join us again 8 p.m. next Monday for the Union Report here on Triangle TV, the home of original public broadcasting. Good night, New Zealand.